Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Springer, JNF CEO. I hope you and your families are all well, and welcome to the fifth in our series of JNF Connect webinars. Our previous webinars, all set within the context of the global pandemic, have touched on a wide range of themes, including resilience, food, business, and investments. And today, quite appropriately, we address the world of science. We're very privileged to have with us Australia's Chief Scientist, Dr. Finkel AO, who together with his wife Elizabeth have been long-standing supporters of the JNF. Alan will be more formally introduced by Jeffrey Appel, OAM, who will moderate today's session. Jeffrey is chairman of JNF Victoria's Gold Patrons, is a senior partner of SBA Law, and serves as a director of a number of communal organisations, including Jewish Care. JNF's support of science and research goes back more than a century, having helped found Israel's leading institutions such as the Technion and Hebrew University. This was, of course, part of a broader mandate since JNF's own founding in 1901 to create a future Jewish homeland and ensure its ongoing sustainability. Given the scale of that ambition, we were forced to take the long view, and that has been ingrained in our DNA ever since. Throughout war, peace, and pandemics, JNF raised the funds necessary to buy land, create communities, reclaim swamps, plant trees, build reservoirs, lay infrastructure, and enable a vibrant Jewish state. An ongoing effort that continues today with a focus on developing Israel's periphery, particularly in the Negev. Recent fruits from that effort include desert agriculture in Israel's south that has managed to feed a country locked down behind closed borders and help it get through this global crisis. Agriculture that was enabled by JNF-funded R&D, recycled water, and infrastructure. Future efforts include expansion of the Nitzanim Ecological Park on Israel's border with Egypt, which recycles water for crops, and ecotourism, and is the focus of this year's Blue Box campaign. Another great example of JNF-funded R&D is the Sderot Resilience Centre, which is becoming a centre of excellence in treating PTSD and is developing a new therapy centre for children. You will hear more about the centre over the next few weeks and months, as this will be the focus of our main campaign this year. Thank you all for your many years of partnership with JNF in helping build a sustainable and resilient Israel, and your ongoing support for our shared mission. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeffrey Appel, and am so pleased that you've all joined us for this special event today. We've opened up to all JNF supporters around Australia, and I welcome you all from my lounge room to your lounge room. JNF Gold Patrons enables a strong group of like-minded people who have a love for Israel to express their support in a social environment. Normally, we have a lunch or drinks to get together. Now, with the assistance of technology, we Zoom, we team, and today we webinar to stay connected. JNF Gold Patrons today are supporting two amazing projects. The Nitzana Ecological Park in the Negev, which is transforming a wastewater plant into a magnificent oasis. And the Sderot Resilience Centre, an outstanding facility to help improve the lives of children living with PTSD. Today we are fortunate to have join us Australia's Chief Scientist, Dr. Finkel AO, who will share with us his thoughts about working in isolation and what has been occupying him. Dr. Finkel was appointed on 25 January 2016 and is the 8th Chief Scientist. Prior to his appointment, he was President of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, Chancellor of Monash University. Dr. Finkel has an extensive science background as an entrepreneur, engineer, neuroscientist, and educator. In his role as Australia's Chief Scientist, he's been extremely busy and has led, in 2016, the National Infrastructure Roadmap, 2017, the National Electricity Market, 2018, STEM Industry Partnership Program, 2019, National Hydrogen Strategy. Today, Dr. Finkel may give us an insight as to what is occupying him in 2020. A couple of housekeeping matters before we kick off. Normally, I would ask you to turn off your phones.
But don't worry, we will do that for you. You will find a chat function. Please, during the presentation, send us a question that you would like to ask Dr. Finkel. And at the end, Dr. Finkel has agreed to answer some. Now, from our lounge room to yours, I invite Dr. Finkel to chat with us.
Okay, Jeffrey, thank you so much. Let me turn myself on so that I'm visible. I think I should be visible for you. And I'm not sure if I'm sharing the right screen, so hang on for a second. Just start that again. Jeffrey, tell me if you're seeing a full screen working in isolation, please.
Yes, I am.
Great, excellent. Well, delighted to be here. And Dan, thank you for your opening remarks. And Jeffrey, thank you for your very warm words. And I am going to take the opportunity of telling you a little bit of the work that I've been doing in the last few months. Of course, work done with so many other people, relevant to not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but issues that have been going on right through that. So I thought I'd do it in terms of a to-do list, a typical day, maybe in the life of many, but in my life is you've got to start off investing in your personal relationships, take a cup of tea to the wife, walk the dog. Notice I've got the order correct. Buying hand sanitizer, I guess that's not every day, but it was a big issue for a while. But what I want to focus on is three things: the COVID-19 response work that I've been doing, the bushfire response work that I've been leading, and a low emissions technology roadmap that I'm helping to develop on behalf of the Energy Minister. So let's start with the COVID-19 response, and in particular, the issue of ventilators. So I'm talking here about ventilators for the ICU, for the intensive care unit. These are the ventilators which require intubation, and they're only needed for people who are in the critically ill phase of COVID-19. But in the middle of March, when we looked at what we had in Australia and looked at what was happening in Italy and France and just beginning to occur in New York, there was huge concern that we would not have enough ventilators. In fact, people were doing back of the envelope calculations where they thought, gosh, we might need 50,000 or even 75,000 ventilators because we would have 75,000 critically ill people in the ward at the same time. And as you know, that's not how it worked out, but that's what the potential concern was. And there's a picture of a patient on a ventilator. So we set a target. We actually decided that the 75,000 was not reasonable. First of all, it would be impossible to achieve. We would not have enough doctors and trained nurses. But a plausible, reasonable target would be 7,500. So I had the privilege in the middle of March of starting the process of developing the Commonwealth Government's approach or strategy to ensuring that we would have enough ventilators. And we developed a 5-track strategy. And the first was almost like the military, to activate the reserves, working with the ANZICS, that's the Australian New Zealand Intensive Care Society. We did a survey, actually the society did the survey, and they found that there were almost double the number of ventilators that they could get their hands on by reaching out to the military, to emergency rooms, to transport ventilators, and that took us up from 2,000 to a higher number. We started a track of purchasing internationally, whilst I had a very reasonable photo for the reserves of showing you a warehouse full of ventilators. Here I'm showing you toilet rolls, but quite deliberately, because at that time it was like the toilet roll hoarding phenomenon writ large, national governments trying to hoard diagnostic tests, protective equipment and ventilators. And so that was a very difficult track that we followed, and we've had some success, but not as much as one would have hoped for initially. The third was to activate a domestic supplier. It turns out Australia has one of the world's most renowned and biggest suppliers of ventilators, but mostly ventilators for non-intensive care use. So I'm talking about the company ResMed, and they do ventilators that people take home to help with sleep apnea, but they also have a small product line of invasive ventilators that have the tubes that go down someone's trachea, but they were struggling to get all the components that they needed in order to make ventilators, because a lot of those components came from China, which was in lockdown. But the Australian government, through a number of different mechanisms, worked with ResMed to support them, to help them to find domestic supplies, to help them to find means of literally air freighting what they needed through closed borders into Australia for them to do the assembly. But that wasn't enough. We felt that wouldn't it be great if we had two sources of domestic supply, because we couldn't trust international supply. Things were still looking a little bit grim at the time. And we managed to activate a second domestic supplier, a company that was not currently making ICU ventilators or any ventilators, but a company that was making a lot of medical grade devices. And they managed to get a license to build an existing ventilator from a UK company that already had the necessary TGA approval. So if built to exactly the same specification, could with confidence be introduced to the Australian market. And that worked spectacularly well, and they're now starting to deliver against the early orders. And the fifth was to channel the energy. There were a lot of small companies, big companies, car manufacturers, aircraft component manufacturers, who felt that they had the skill set to make a ventilator. The trouble is that at the end of the day, the ventilator is going to be used on a human being, not on a balloon in a laboratory, on a laboratory lab bench. So they had to be made to a very, very high standard. And I ended up working with 15 ICU specialists from around Australia and New Zealand to develop a specification, which is now published on the Australian government's TGA website, that tells any aspiring manufacturer this is the minimum set of features and quality that you have to achieve in order to bring a ventilator onto the market. Now, it worked really well. What was the goal? The goal was to balance the supply versus demand equation. Equality would be good. If we weren't going to be equal, we wanted to have more supply than demand. Well, as it turns out, we've got huge supply now and a tiny, tiny demand. Why? Because the Australian governments, that's the Commonwealth government and the state governments, worked so spectacularly well to advise the community, to implement the public health measures, and to flatten the growth curve really early at a very, very low level, which you're all aware of. So thankfully, the ventilators that we now have are sitting on the shelf, but some have actually already been supplied internationally. My brother Ron was instrumental in getting 20 ventilators with the Australian government approval sent across to the Palestinian Authority for their much more existential need than ours. So that was a real success story. It was all very fast. We're only talking about 5 or 6 weeks from beginning to end of that whole procedure, supported by Commonwealth Government Taskforce that did a splendid job. Okay, so I can put a tick on the COVID-19 Ventilator Taskforce. And now I'm going to look at a thing called the Rapid Research Information Forum, which is completely different. And what it is addressing is how do you bring the best expertise, the research knowledge of the global research community to the attention of government so that it can become a consideration for government to take into account when making decisions. So we've implemented this new forum called the RIF, the Rapid Research Information Forum, and the process is pretty simple. A minister has a question. That question comes to a group of academy experts that I chair. I've personally convened the RIF, and I chair it, and we go out and in a very quick turnaround, 10 days, we produce a short, readable synthesis of the best information for that question and provide it back to the minister. And it's been very, very well received. We've done 11. I'm actually going to show you the 11 questions. I'm not going to go through the detailed answers, but it'll give you a sense of the breadth of what we've been looking at. Quite a focus on health issues, but not entirely. The first one, the question is written at the top: what is the likely impact of winter on the spread and severity of COVID-19? This question came to us from the Health Minister, but it was really channeling the Prime Minister's question and interest as well. The concern being, we're coming out of summer into winter. Is that going to be a factor that takes control out of our hands? And the answer is, it's an issue, but it's well within our ability through public health measures and personal sanitisation measures to moderate. And so whilst winter is a factor, it's not a large one. The second one we looked at was the likelihood of reinfection. There had been reports in the press that some people who had been infected had recovered, had a negative test for the virus, and then a couple of weeks later, they tested positive again. So there was a growing concern that having been infected did not confer immunity. Well, it turns out that there were no proven cases like that. It's quite likely that people who had gone through that sequence had reported negative because it was a false negative. The tests are not perfect, and they really actually had not recovered. There is a strong likelihood, but not a guarantee, strong likelihood that if you've been infected, you will have antibodies, and those antibodies will confer you immunity. The third one was a fascinating one, and you might have seen this referred to in the press. Can we monitor the prevalence, the spread of the virus, not only by going out and doing random samples of individuals, but by sampling the wastewater? Why the wastewater? Because it's actually been known and proven that viral particles, viral RNA, goes through your system, comes out through with the feces into the wastewater system, and it only takes about 8 hours from flush to the wastewater outlet. And if you can do very sensitive testing at the wastewater outlet, you can get an idea of whether a zone or a suburb of 10,000 or 20,000 houses has indeed undetected illnesses, coronavirus cases, or is clear of coronavirus. And there's a lot of work going on. Our conclusion was, it certainly 4 weeks ago, wasn't quite ready for prime time. This technique is used to measure the spread or to monitor the spread of polio and illicit drugs. But because of our low prevalence rate, it's not quite sensitive enough, although the tests are getting better and better, and it might be around about now. We did a review on antibody testing, so you could monitor the population and find out who had been detected, who had had the disease but never had the symptoms, and that's perfectly plausible, although the one thing one has to remember is the antibody tests have to be nearly 100% accurate in a country like Australia where the prevalence rates are very low. Outside the medical field, we did for the Education Minister a review on what are the likely long-term impacts of online learning versus in-class learning. And it's complicated. It turns out for the kids who are well supported by parents and having their own computer, the online learning works very well. But kids from, say, lower income families who don't have access to their own computer or good internet, or parents who have the time to assist them, it's a bit of a problem. But the evidence does indicate that if it only goes on for 3 months, the kids recover and get back onto their learning schedule very, very effectively. We looked at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the employment in the Australian research workforce, because it's important that that research workforce is there to support us in the recovery, and the impact is significant, but I won't go into the details. We've looked at what's the likelihood of vaccines being available this year or next year, and where are the promising ones being developed? How confident should you be? I can tell you it's a glass half full, glass half empty answer. You should be worried about the prospects of us ever developing a vaccine, because there's never been a vaccine developed for a coronavirus in the past. On the other hand, there's never been such a highly funded, well-skilled worldwide effort to develop vaccines as we're seeing now for the COVID-19 virus. So I personally am very optimistic that we will have a vaccine. It takes time for them to be tested. So will it be the end of this year or sometime next year? I don't know, but I'm reasonably optimistic that we'll get there. We looked at the impact of the differential impact of the lockdown on women in the science workforce versus men in the science workforce, and there is a differential impact, worse for women. We looked at, I mentioned before, the promising vaccines, but we've also done a study on the promising therapeutics. Now, all the work that's being done at the moment is on repurposing existing medicines to see if they'll be useful. There is one called remdesivir, which has been shown in some controlled studies to have some benefit, but it's not huge, and that's the best prospect at the moment. So it's not all that encouraging, and it's likely that treatments will come from combinations of the existing therapies yet to be explored, or from the development of new therapeutics. We looked at the viability on surfaces: paper, banknotes, clothes, steel, copper, and actually the virus remains viable for up to a couple of days on most surfaces. The good news is that normal domestic cleaning procedures are very effective at cleaning up the surfaces and removing the viability of the virus. Intriguingly, especially for those of you who are boat owners and have done anti-fouling paint, intriguingly, copper kills the virus. So viruses do not survive more than 4 hours at most on copper surfaces, and copper is the active ingredient in most anti-fouling paints on ships. No coincidence. Last one I wanted to mention was a sociological one, where we looked at the COVIDsafe app, and the question that we responded to is, what motivates people to download and to continue to use the COVIDsafe app? As you would expect, it's complicated. In Australia, the download rate, I think in percentage terms, has been higher than in any other comparable country in the world, and very much because there's considerable trust in government during the pandemic, because through the National Cabinet, we've had very clear leadership. It's been perfect, nothing's perfect, but it's been very, very good and acknowledged by many people to be so. Okay, back to the to-do list. We could say that I've covered the Rapid Research Information Forum, and the next thing that I would like to look at is bushfire response. And now we're getting, I should say, do you remember the bushfires? Because for a lot of people, myself included, the intensity of the initial COVID-19 response was such that everything else got pushed off the desk. So I got asked by the Prime Minister, well, the Prime Minister asked in late January the CSIRO, Australia's National Science Research Agency, to do a report on how we can improve Australia's preparedness for disasters that are becoming worse because of climate change. And I say that not incidentally. It is looking at, it's accepting that climate change is an issue. And the CSIRO was asked by the Prime Minister to work closely with an expert advisory panel that I'm chairing. The work's ongoing work, and it's already shown some interesting things. It has to be finished by the end of this month, and it'll be going to National Cabinet. One of the most important things we've committed to is to build on previous learnings. None of us wanted to be naive and say, we'll look at this and solve all the past problems. There have been hundreds of reports on bushfires in the last 150 years. And there are reasons to think that we're doing much better today than we would have if we hadn't learned. So, for example, if you go back to Black Saturday in 2009 in Victoria, there were a lot of fatalities, 173 fatalities, very tragic. About 500,000 hectares burned, and that was one of the biggest fires ever. In fact, up until this summer, we'd never had fires that in a season burnt out more than 1 million hectares. But this year, in Black Summer, 17 million hectares, huge expanse of Australia's bush burned. 17 million compared to 500,000, that's over 30 times more land burned, much of it with houses and roads and other infrastructure. There were 33 fatalities. Every single one of them is a tragedy, but that's a very small number compared to what we saw on Black Saturday in Victoria for a much bigger extensiveness of the fires. So we clearly are learning. I draw your attention to the sentence at the top there. The words, Australia's climate is changing, that is the first sentence in the terms of reference that the CSIRO and my expert advisory panel are working on that came to us from the Prime Minister. There's been a change in the narrative from the Commonwealth Government about the acceptance of climate being a factor that is causing change that has economic, environmental and health impact on our society. The operating principles that we have for this review is, first of all, that everything we do has to be, it's the CSIRO and the chief scientist, after all, has to be evidence-based and with a purpose of improving our climate and disaster resilience, that we're trying to offer science and technology contributions rather than, if you look at the third one, the legislative or organisational recommendations. We leave that to the Royal Commission, and as I've already noted, we're building on and complementing existing work. In terms of the recommendations, I can't share the specific recommendations. They're still being finalised and they will be going to Cabinet, but it's not unreasonable for me to give you a sneak peek. We'll be looking at recommending that all the states in their disaster preparedness scenarios use consistent foreseeable climate scenarios, because they're all using different ones at the moment. Harmonising the information that is used in the fire apps and communicated to residents at risk is critically important. There is opportunity to make recommendations around the materials that are used to give buildings heat resistance, and also the setbacks of vegetation, native vegetation and non-native vegetation, and also the setbacks of barbecue seats and other things around the house, wooden seats. We've got a few recommendations about the need to be prepared for coincident and sequential threats, which are occurring more and more as a result of climate change. So coincident are things like a drought and massive bushfires at the same time. Sequential threats are things like the bushfires followed immediately by extreme flooding. And the last one that I'll mention to you is a technological one. How can we most effectively deal with the challenges that come from the fact that we have sector coupling? We can't independently look at electricity, transport, communication, and water as separate sectors. Each one depends on the other. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the bushfire response. Now let me look at the last big one, the low emissions technology roadmap. So this is a piece of work for the government to look at how Australia can make a transition to a low emissions future. The work is being done for the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, Angus Taylor, supported by a Commonwealth department called the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. And it's a critically important part of the government's long-term emissions reduction strategy. Angus Taylor is being advised by a ministerial reference panel, and I'm chairing the ministerial reference panel. It's got very prestigious people on it from across the industry, research and investment community. The important thing is that this is not a report that's being done independently and thrown at the government to either accept or reject. We're actually helping the minister develop a report that he will own. He will argue with the backbenchers, he will argue with Cabinet, he will argue with Parliament, and he will argue with the community. And I think that's a great thing, because when you do a fully independent report and throw it over the fence, it's really a lot of luck as to whether it will be accepted and promoted by the audience. And the output will be an annual low emissions technology statement. So it's not just going to be done once. By the end of September this year, September the 30th, the intention is that we'll go out with the inaugural low emissions technology statement, and then there'll be an update each year. And that statement will indicate to the research community and to the investment community and to the regulators where the government sees the most prospective opportunities for lowering emissions in an economically viable and secure manner. So we have to optimize all of those things. In terms of where it fit in, let me first go through the guiding principles. As we're choosing the technologies that we want to go through, we're using 4 filters. We're only interested in things that will significantly lower emissions at scale. So if it's small, it's not going to get Commonwealth government focus. It won't get ignored, but it won't get focus. And we're also looking at things that have significant economic impact and economic opportunity. Otherwise, it really doesn't deserve Commonwealth government focus. To the extent that we can, we'll look for things that build on Australia's comparative advantage. For example, if we are to build an energy export industry around clean hydrogen, clean ammonia, green steel, we have the advantage of being a trusted trading partner. We have the advantage of lots of sun, lots of wind, the ability and the expertise to make the electricity and the hydrogen, take the iron oxide and make green steel as an export opportunity. And technological readiness, that's a subtle one about to what extent and to how much will government invest at various stages, from research through demonstration through deployment. Now, in terms of where this fits in, the government has announced, but it's not public yet, the content's not public, a long-term whole of economy emissions reduction plan. So I've got that as the arch in this little sample of Greek architecture. The plinth across the top, the long-term whole of economy emissions reduction plan. Now, the pillars that support that are many. One is the already accepted National Hydrogen Strategy that was adopted by all the state, territory and Commonwealth governments last November. I was the chair of the process to develop that. The government is currently developing an electric vehicle strategy. The fact that they're doing that is known, but the content is not yet announced at all, but that will be one of the pillars contributing to the whole of economy emissions reduction plan. The third pillar will be the low emissions technology roadmap I've just been talking to you about. But as good as all those things are, they're worthless unless you've got policy and regulations and intentions to integrate them into the economy. And that policy piece will probably be brought forward as part of the ultimate announcement of the long-term whole of economy emissions roadmap. Okay, so I've done the low emissions technology roadmap, and I thought I would just quickly finish off with some learnings. So in terms of the pandemic, and you'll all have your own learnings, but what I've seen is the benefit of collegiate government. As you know, you've lived through as a federation. We don't always have collegiate government. We do sometimes have state governments arguing with the Commonwealth government, vice versa, and with each other. But what we've seen is through the National Cabinet and the leadership of the Prime Minister and the Premiers, we've seen thoughtful approaches, well advised by experts, and that's been communicated really well to us, to the community. So that's one big learning. And the other is part of the process that you're not possibly seeing yet, but through the National COVID Coordination Committee and various other mechanisms the government has in place and state governments have in place, the intention is through the stimulus funding, not just help Australia recover to where it was before the epidemic, but to recover to a better place. In terms of the bushfires, the learnings are the importance of learnings. Not being arrogant and thinking, it's all up to you. You've got to build on what's been done in the past. We're seeing clear opportunity to use technology well to detect fires and respond to fires and warn people to get them out, etc. And the need to be responsive to the lessons that we're learning about climate change so that we can plan more effectively for coincident and sequential events. On the technology investment roadmap that I was talking to you about, what we're really saying there, and I probably didn't make it clear, is the proposal here is to use technology to fix the problems that technology has wrought. Coal, oil, gas, they've served society fabulously well, but it's like good medicines, there's a side effect. And we are now looking at the treatment by applying new, fresh technology to try to fix those problems. And the other lesson is that random approaches aren't going to do it. We're hoping through this process of selected supporting strategies, the government will be able to go forward by the end of this year with a whole of economy low emissions strategy. If not by the end of this year, it will certainly be before COP26, otherwise known as Glasgow. The next UN meeting was going to be in November this year. That's when the government was aiming to release their mega strategy. Glasgow has been postponed till next year, but the government will release before that for sure. Working at home, gosh, we're doing it now. Video conferencing, 40 years on. It's finally, I say 40 years on because when I was doing my PhD in the mid-1970s, one of my lecturers was working with Bell Labs, the Bell Research Labs in America, to develop video conferencing on phones in the mid-1970s. And I don't know about your opinion, but until a few months ago, I thought the video conferencing still wasn't ready for routine use, and it wasn't. Something's changed in the last few months. It's fantastic what we can do with Zoom. It's a combination of the NBN and bandwidth, the cameras in computers, the sound systems, and the tools such as Zoom and Google Meets and Microsoft Teams, which are great. Look, you know, they're my learnings. Bessie's my dog. Bessie is delighted that I'm working from home. And Bessie, her learning is she thinks I'm working from home because I love her. Arthur, the picture there of Arthur. Arthur is my son's dog. Arthur likes having the house to himself. I don't think he's happy that they're home all day. Arthur, I'm sure, has learned, his learning is he thinks that Alex got fired. But all up, it's been a great experience, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just trying to get my photo up.
Can you see me moving?
I can see you. But,
good.
Okay, well, we'll just keep going. That was amazing. Thanks so much, Alan, for sharing with us and providing such how busy you have been over this period. We have had a number of questions come through, and I'll understand you're happy to answer a few, so let me throw a couple at you. So Joe from Israel actually has asked us a question. He said, is there international cooperation in search for an effective vaccine, or is it still all competitive based?
It is extremely, it's a bit of both, but there's a lot of international cooperation. There's an entity called CEPI, that has raised from governments around the world billions of dollars. They've been doing this for years, but the funds flowing in this year are huge. And they are funding, I think CEPI has got about 6 different vaccine projects going on, including one in Australia, which is centred at the University of Queensland, who are then cooperating with CSL, our big biotech manufacturing company. And there are active discussions going on at national government level to ensure that whenever and wherever the first vaccine is shown to be effective, that the funds are there for it to be made in sufficient volumes that all countries get access to it. That's the pledge, that's the interest. When it first appears, I sincerely hope that toilet roll hoarding phenomenon doesn't re-emerge and see some countries trying to exercise their weight to get first dibs at the vaccines, because this is a global pandemic, and whatever company, whatever country facilitated effort, university research effort that leads to the first vaccine, none of it's in isolation. So it's extremely competitive in the sense that there are about, I think about 11 that have gone into clinical trials around the world. Extremely competitive, but each of those is some kind of collaboration, and many of them get their funding from the same sources, which itself is funded from governments across the world. So I actually bridle when people think the solution to all problems in research is collaboration. It's part of the solution. I have a research background as well as a business background. I can tell you competition is really important. It sharpens the mind. And so if you can get the good combination of competition and collaboration, that's where I think you get the fastest progress. And that's what we are seeing in the world of vaccine development.
Thank you. We all know that at the beginning there was a lot of discussion about who's going to be able to have a test, are there enough tests available, and there was a whole process, and at the end you could drive through Chadstone and have a test if you felt like you should have one. So we've got a question from Nadine. what are your thoughts about the Ben Gurion nano breath test?
The Ben Gurion nano breath test, I don't know enough about it. Does Nadine have any information?
Well, maybe Nadine will give us some more information while we go on to something.
But the important question, though, of availability of testing, it's crucially important. And we actually don't know, if you compare, say, America to Australia, their death rate for known corona cases, it's huge. It's like 13 or 14%. In Australia, it's 1.3 or 1.4%. The death rate for known coronavirus cases is a tenth here. Is that because we've got a different variety of the coronavirus? No, there's no evidence of that. Is that because our medical health system is 10 times superior? I personally think that we've got an excellent medical health system here, but I don't think it's 10 times superior to the American one. It leaves you with the conclusion that they're just not testing as extensively as they need to, given the prevalence of the virus in their community. So the public health methodology to flattening the curve, which we've done so well in Australia, is to test and to trace and to isolate. But it starts with testing. And early on, we could only test people that had very manifest symptoms. But now we've probably got tests sitting on the shelf that we can't use enough because people aren't volunteering to have tests done. And that's not a shame. That's fine, given that we've done so well in flattening the curve. But massive testing is a critical part of public health. You need the testing, the trace, the isolation, of course, the public health measures of social isolation and personal sanitary practices of not going to work or into public if you're coughing or sick, and washing your hands 10 times a day or 20 times a day, and singing happy birthday twice.
So here's another one. It says, when Australia comes out on the other side of this pandemic, how do you see Australia dealing with the new challenges which we will face, such as in the fields of science, technology, and development?
It's a real concern of mine, and I don't have a comfortable answer. We've done very well because the government, for a number of reasons that I alluded to, and one of the things I said was the government taking expert advice. And I'm not talking about myself necessarily. It takes some advice from me, but it's taken in this pandemic quite appropriately most of its expert advice from the Chief Medical Officer of the Commonwealth and the state Chief Medical Officers and their support committees. Why are those experts able to provide such effective advice? It's been brilliantly effective. It's because we've got a pretty strong research capability, especially in medical health. We've got two funding branches for government-funded medical research, the NHMRC and another one called the MRFF. And we've got a long history of excellent research in many, many areas, but in particular across all the medical areas, and we spend a lot in that medical research. But overall, government funding for fundamental research has been declining because of it not being increased to keep pace with inflation, and it's been hard to get a commitment to turn that around. On top of that, one of the additional funding sources that is a non-government funding source is the reutilisation of fees that come from international students. It's an accepted deal, if you like, between the international students and the universities. And ultimately, universities put more money into the university research base is the biggest research base, and there's more university dollars that goes into that than government dollars. Well, that is taking a serious hit because of the lockdown, international students not coming in, and the universities are hurting. And it's likely that that will lead, it already has led to a reduction in the non-critical COVID-19 research, but it's critical research from the point of view of building our skills base and also the research capability that will help industry recover to a better place rather than the same place. So there's a lot of awareness of this challenge. I mean, personally, a lot of discussion with government about this at the highest levels, but the solutions are not yet in hand. But we do have to address it because we've got the evidence that the research capability is important for a crisis. And you've got the evidence, not just in Australia, but in countries like Israel, where if you look for countries that are growing rapidly, fabulous economic performance, they have a strong R&D base.
One more question before we go to bushfires, still on COVID, from Jack. What is the prospect of
hydroxychloroquine?
The word, that long one, COVID. You'll pronounce the word for me.
Hydroxychloroquine.
That's it.
What is the prospects for it? Oh, it's murky. It's really murky. So this is an arthritis drug, an existing drug. You've all heard about it. I won't tell you about it. And it's the one that became famous because President Donald Trump touted it on the base of some French trials. That initial French report was done in the height of the pandemic. It was very, very poor research practices. Not only were there no controls, but the people who did get it were selected for reasons that are unclear. Some people who died were taken out of the totals. It was just a mess done in a panic, and it indicated that hydroxychloroquine was effective. Since then, there have been a lot more trials, and there was a huge trial that was reported in The Lancet. And then subsequently, just a few days later, it became apparent that the database of patient outcomes that they were using was possibly not as credible as it should have been. So where we've had a positive result, you can challenge it. Where we've had a negative result, you can challenge it. If I was facing an existential crisis with COVID-19, I probably would not take it. I don't think the evidence is there, but then I'm not as wise as Donald Trump. So I'll leave it at that.
Paul asks a question to do with the fires. There is no one single approach to reducing carbon emission. There are dozens of them. What are the most likely high priority areas to work on?
Look, very, very good question. And we're looking across the economy. The biggest sector, so I'll just stick with scale. The biggest sector of the economy is for emissions is the electricity sector, responsible for 35% of the emissions. So the biggest bang for the buck is bringing in more solar and more wind, ultimately to replace the high emissions coal, or let's say in the first place to replace the high emissions coal, and ultimately to replace the lesser emissions from natural gas. It's not easy, but it's not that hard. We're actually on a roll in Australia. The per capita rate of installation of solar and wind electricity generation in Australia for the last couple of years is the highest in the world, 3 times higher than the second highest country, which is Germany. And our electricity market operator, AEMO, is smart and thinking hard about how to integrate solar and wind while still maintaining security and reaping the benefits of the ever diminishing price. But to get to the point of 100% renewables, it's going to take time, 20 to 30 years. But you can see the path getting there. So that's my fundamental answer to the question, solar and wind. Then you've got to look at the other sectors of the economy. Transport is huge. It's about 18% of the emissions. And the pathway is visible to pretty much anybody who looks to replace all of the petrol-powered and diesel-powered vehicles with battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. You can see a future not that far into the future, 10, 15 or 20 years, where all new trains, trucks, ground transport, so cars, trains, trucks and buses would be zero emissions and capable of long distances and carrying heavy cargo. The real challenge in the transportation segment is aviation, long distance aviation. I don't think in my lifetime I'll get on a jumbo jet that flies from Melbourne to Los Angeles without stopping that's powered by batteries. So we have to find a solution. Will it be some derivative of clean hydrogen? I think so. Then I can go from there to industry to agriculture. It gets harder and harder. But the two biggest are the stationary electricity sector of our economy and transportation.
Thank you. Gabby from Sydney asks, JNF Gold Patrons have recently supported the visit of water experts from Israel to advise Australia. Is there a close working relationship between Australia and Israel with reference to innovation and science?
The answer is yes, but I personally have not been working in that area for quite a while. But when I was Chancellor of Monash University, I got to see firsthand how we were the lead of the CRC, the Cooperative Research Centre, a multi-university centre for water sustainable cities. And we had a number of projects that involved collaborations with Israel. There's expertise at both ends, not just in the technology, but in policy matters as well. I'll tell you what's very important in the water aspect for Australia going forward is learning from Israel about high volume economic desalination, not necessarily because we need it for our cities and agriculture in the way that Israel does, but it might end up underpinning the future clean hydrogen export industry that we hope to build, because to make hydrogen, you have to take solar electricity or wind electricity and crack water. And people aren't going to be happy if we're tapping into drinking water or water that's otherwise used for agriculture. But it's quite clear that the cost of desalinating water to feed the machines that make the hydrogen is quite modest. But if it can be reduced from 3% to 2% or 2% to 1% by building on the kind of phenomenal expertise that Israel has built up in reverse osmosis water desalination, I see that as an important long-term collaboration beyond what you're already familiar with in terms of water-sensitive cities and agriculture and recycling of wastewater.
Just moving to a question to do with the coal industry. Vicky asks, are you confident that Australia will ultimately disband the coal industry? And if so, over what time frame?
Vicky, that's a very policy-oriented question, and I'll leave the actual answer to the politicians, but I will say this. We have two ways that we use coal in Australia. One is domestic consumption, which is almost exclusively for electricity generation, and of course we use coal for export. It's not obvious to me that we can ever build another coal-fired electricity generator that would be compatible with low emissions. So those plants, as they get to their 50-year or thereabout lifetimes, they're exiting the market. In terms of exports, it's really very, very difficult. There are two purposes to which exported coal is used. One is so-called thermal coal, which is to be used in India and China and other places to run in their electricity generators. And the reality is that coal doesn't come from Australia, it'll come from somewhere else. So if in the first instance we see the exit of our coal generators domestically, that does contribute to lowering global emissions. They're gone. But if we were to arbitrarily stop our exports, it doesn't contribute to lowering global emissions because our source of supply will be filled by other suppliers. There's just no question of that. But if we can help other countries to transition off coal-fired electricity to renewable electricity through exporting some of our investment expertise and technological expertise, so be it, and that would be fantastic. The other use of exported coal is for steel making. It's called metallurgical coal. And again, if we don't export it, somebody else will. The world needs steel, but we will work with our customer countries and we will work with customer companies to help them on the transition from ordinary steel, which uses coal, to what is now referred to as green steel, which is made with no coal whatsoever. It's made with clean hydrogen, clean electricity, and iron ore. And Australia can take a leading role in driving that transition. And it's big because steel, just steel making globally, is responsible for 7% of greenhouse gas emissions. Just one industrial subsector. It's massive. So, complex answer.
So just one more on energy before we wrap her up. And Colin asks, in the short term, is nuclear power the quickest way for us to fund the growth in our economy?
The quickest way to fund the growth?
Yes.
Probably not. Probably not. I do believe that we should have a discussion about nuclear power, but in Australia, there's legislation that says we can't even consider doing it. If there's a future for nuclear power, it's, in my opinion, highly unlikely to be what has been the traditional nuclear power station, which are giant bespoke entities, lots of civil engineering, lots of complex engineering, running at 1, 2 or 3 gigawatts. They're incredibly expensive to build. They're incredibly expensive to operate, and they're just getting more and more expensive to build and operate because of the additional layers of safety requirements and emissions requirements that have come up over the years. And Fukushima was a disaster from that point of view. Good luck building a giant nuclear power station for any kind of competitive price today. But there's an alternative future for nuclear called SMR, which stands for Small Modular Reactor. And in this case, the word small has to be looked at as a relative term. It's small compared to giant. We're talking about reactors that are about 200 tons and 20 meters, like a 40-foot container, you know, a big shipping container, but very heavy machines. But they're small enough to be transported by road, and they're small enough to be made in a factory. They only put out, say, 50 megawatts instead of 2,000 megawatts. But if you want a 2,000 megawatt installation, you'd have put in 40 of them. The beauty is by being made in a factory, you get the economies of scale, you get the reliability and quality that comes from a refined process. But they're not in place anywhere in the world. There's one company called NuScale that's going through the regulatory process in America, and after a 4-year process, they're likely to get final judgment at the end of this year, and so far everything's looking good. If NuScale is successful and they've got contracts already to start building plants of 10 or 12 of these units, we'll probably watch that for a while. And if we watch them and they're successful, then maybe the Australian government might consider nuclear. It's got the virtue of being absolutely zero emissions, but it's not cheap. Even the mass-produced ones, on current estimates by the company that's making them, will be 3 times more expensive per unit of electricity than today's solar and wind. And that gap will probably grow, but solar and wind is getting cheaper and cheaper. So funding the economy, I think not. But being a contributor to the resilience of our energy system at a zero emissions level, I think there's a role, because I find it very uncomfortable as a trained electrical engineer and a manufacturer in my past to be reliant on too few sources of fundamental supply. And if we end up in a world where it's just sun and wind, I'm not suggesting we'll ever run out of sunshine or that we'll ever run out of wind, but will we run out of the resources to make them? Will there be other planning problems? It'd be nice to think that there were some additional sources of supply.
So the last question.
You said that a moment ago.
No, this is the last one. What is your earliest memory of your connection with JNF?
Joe Chrysler.
Excellent answer. Alan, this is an amazing webinar. I think everybody has stayed in the room. Everybody's been thoroughly interested in all that you've had to say. The amount of work you've been doing in your whole period since the Chief Scientist for Australia is outstanding. And this year you have been extremely busy. So on behalf of JNF Gold Patrons and JNF Australia, we thank you so very much for your help and your assistance today in informing us as to what's going on. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today in what has been an outstanding presentation. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Jeffrey.